The story of gods doesn't start with thunder, miracles, or cosmic drama. It starts with ordinary people trying to make sense of a world that rarely explained itself. Long before writing, before cities, before organized belief systems, humans faced a constant stream of unknowns. Storms moved in without warning, illness struck without reason, life appeared and disappeared with no clear pattern. In that kind of world, unanswered questions weren't just philosophical problems, they were threats. And where there is threat, the mind searches for structure. Patterns gave early humans a sense of control. If an animal moved in a certain way, or the wind shifted, they tried to link it to something predictable. Our ancestors had incredibly sharp pattern recognition instincts, because missing a pattern could mean getting hunted or starving. But those same instincts also created patterns where none existed. When lightning hit a nearby tree, it felt personal. When the sun rose each day, it looked intentional. The world seemed filled with deliberate forces, even when nothing conscious was behind them. The earliest gods weren't fully formed personalities. They were blurry explanations, an unseen presence behind the storm, a vague force guiding the herd, a spirit lurking in the forest. Over time, these ideas solidified into characters. People gave them names, emotions, motives, and responsibilities. The moment nature felt personal, it became negotiable. If something was a who rather than a what, you could talk to it, bargain with it, or try to win its favor. That shift was powerful. It turned confusion into a relationship. Instead of facing an indifferent universe, people believed they were dealing with something that listened. Once that leap was made, a hierarchy of divine beings became almost unavoidable. Different groups developed different gods because different environments created different fears and priorities. A coastal community shaped its spirituality around the sea. A desert tribe shaped its beliefs around the sun and scarce water. A farming culture elevated gods connected to fertility, harvests, and seasonal cycles. Human circumstances sculpted the divine, not the other way around. As societies grew more complex, their gods grew with them. Small villages didn't need a cosmic bureaucratic system, but early cities did. When thousands of people lived together, they built political structures, and these structures quietly seeped into their mythology. Gods developed ranks, duties, and entire cosmic governance that mirrored human society. A chief god resembled a king. A council of gods resembled an assembly. Angels, spirits, or lower deities resembled administrators and servants. Divine hierarchy was simply social hierarchy projected into the sky. Beliefs also served practical functions. If a society needed unity, the gods became unifying symbols. If leaders needed obedience, they framed their power as sacred. If a community faced hardship, the gods became emotional safety nets, capable of promising rewards that life couldn't guarantee. Once a belief system helped hold a group together, it became harder to question, because questioning could be seen as destabilizing the entire community. This is why religions didn't just explain the world. They offered structure, purpose, identity, and moral rules long before legal systems or scientific methods existed. When there was no reliable way to test claims, stories stepped in. The more detailed a story was, the more convincingly it answered questions. And the more it answered questions, the more it shaped behavior. People didn't only believe because the stories made sense. They believed because the stories became part of how they understood themselves. One of the strongest forces that shaped early gods was uncertainty. The fear of death loomed over every culture. Early humans didn't live long, and survival was always fragile. As soon as people realized what death was, they had to confront a reality they had no tools to cope with. The idea of an afterlife didn't begin as comfort. It began as a way to avoid a psychological dead end. Without some form of continuation, existence felt too abrupt, so people filled the gap with visions of ancestors, spirits, and realms that mirrored life but extended beyond it. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in burial sites dating tens of thousands of years back. Graves contained tools, ornaments, and food, suggesting that people believed the dead still needed these things. That belief wasn't rooted in observation. There was no proof of any kind. It emerged because the mind resists finality. The earliest divine beings often began as ancestors, gradually turning into protectors, judges, or intermediaries between the living and the mysterious world beyond. As societies expanded, belief systems didn't simply stay spiritual, they became intertwined with power. Leaders realized that divine approval made their authority stronger. If the gods supported the ruler, loyalty became a matter of both civic duty and cosmic order. This idea wasn't exclusive to any one culture. Egyptians treated their pharaohs as divine or semi-divine. Mesopotamian kings claimed their right to rule came from the gods. Early Chinese dynasties relied on the mandate of heaven, which could be lost or granted depending on how rulers behaved. Religion provided a narrative that fused morality, politics, and social stability. Once divine hierarchy was linked to human hierarchy, questioning the gods became a dangerous act. Doubting the divine could look like doubting the entire structure of society. That pressure preserved belief systems long after their original purposes had faded. Even when people encountered contradictions or saw flaws in religious explanations, the social cost of disbelief was often too high. Tradition, fear, and identity created a powerful combination that kept these ideas alive. Knowledge gaps played a central role in shaping the gods. Before medicine, illnesses were invisible arrows shot by unseen forces. Before meteorology, storms were tempers of the sky. Before astronomy, the stars were messages or ancestors or beings themselves. Every unexplained event became an invitation for myth. Over time, these myths were polished, expanded and standardized by storytellers, priests, scholars, and rulers. What began as scattered beliefs slowly turned into organized doctrines, with rules, rituals, and sacred texts. Once writing emerged, religions gained permanence. Stories that previously shifted with each retelling became fixed. People could point to written words as authoritative. This gave religions far more stability, but it also locked them into specific worldviews, sometimes long after those worldviews became outdated. A text written in one era could shape lives thousands of years later, even if the context had completely changed. The divine hierarchy grew even more complex with the rise of empires. When different cultures merged, their gods merged with them. Conquerors absorbed the gods of the conquered. Similar deities were blended together. New myths were created to explain how these gods interacted. The result was a patchwork of beliefs that reflected centuries of cultural exchange. In some cases, older gods were demoted to the status of angels, demons, or spirits as new belief systems took precedence. These changes weren't spiritual evolutions. They were political consolidations. What's striking across history is how flexible gods have been. They adapted to the needs, fears, and values of each generation. When people needed justice, gods became judges. When people needed hope, gods became protectors. When people needed social order, gods became lawmakers. The divine hierarchy didn't descend from the sky. It rose from human imagination, reflecting our desires and limitations. As the script continues, we'll explore how religions solidified their authority, how certain gods overtook others, why monotheism emerged from polytheism, how holy texts gained their status, and how psychological mechanisms kept divine systems intact even as knowledge advanced. The rise of monotheism is often presented as a moral or spiritual breakthrough, but historically it looks more like an administrative shift. When a society has dozens or hundreds of gods, each with their own roles, rituals, and followers, keeping track of everything becomes complicated. As states centralized, belief systems did too. A single supreme deity simplified political unity. Instead of many gods belonging to many tribes, one god could belong to the entire nation. This wasn't the triumph of truth, it was the triumph of efficiency. Early versions of one god weren't as absolute as later interpretations. Some cultures had a chief god who ruled over others, but people still acknowledged the existence of smaller deities. Over centuries, that hierarchy tightened. The chief god gained more authority while the others faded or were absorbed into its personality. Eventually, the smaller spirits were either reinterpreted as angels, demons, or symbolic figures. The divine family tree was reorganized, trimmed, and edited until the idea of a single all-powerful being felt natural. The shift toward monotheism also came from political instability. When societies faced invasions, droughts, or internal conflict, a unified belief system provided psychological strength. If people believed one god controlled everything, then disasters could be blamed on human disobedience rather than random chaos. This kept communities cohesive. It turned suffering into a test, defeat into a lesson, and survival into validation. Even when evidence didn't match the story made the suffering meaningful. Monotheism amplified the moral authority of religion. A god who controls everything also claims moral jurisdiction over everything. Instead of gods with specific domains like fertility, war, or the sea, a single deity could now legislate on every aspect of life, from diet to sex to property. This expansion of divine authority allowed religious leaders to regulate society with unprecedented scope. When moral rules came from the highest possible authority, they weren't suggestions, they were cosmic laws that no human could question without risking spiritual punishment. With this shift came a deeper form of obedience. In polytheistic systems, gods could be negotiated with. If you angered one, you might appease another. If one god failed you, you could turn to a different one. But in monotheistic systems, there was no alternative. The same God who created you also judged you. The same God who blessed you could destroy you. That consolidation of power created a perfect environment for religious institutions to grow in influence. Questioning the institution became equivalent to questioning the entire universe. Many ancient societies used this to stabilize their rule. Leaders tied their legitimacy directly to divine authority. Moral behavior, loyalty, and social order were all framed as obedience not to rulers, but to the ultimate creator. This strategy allowed political and religious elites to reinforce each other. When a rule served the state, it could be written into religion. When religion needed enforcement, the state provided muscle. This partnership is part of why religions survived for millennia, even when their explanations for natural events were repeatedly disproven. Psychology played a major role in keeping these systems strong. One of the most powerful cognitive mechanisms humans experience is agency detection, the tendency to assume some kind of mind is behind events. A sound in the dark feels like someone watching, a sudden illness feels like someone targeting. Agency detection helped our ancestors survive predators, but it also made supernatural explanations intuitive. People didn't need evidence to assume a conscious force was behind lightning or disease. The assumption felt obvious. Another psychological mechanism that shaped divine hierarchies is moralizing. Once humans became capable of complex social structures, they needed ways to regulate behavior, especially when groups became too large for personal reputation to enforce cooperation. If a community believed an invisible being monitored their behavior at all times, they were less likely to steal, lie, or commit violence. This made divine surveillance a useful tool for early societies. The idea of a moralizing God wasn't just spiritual, it was political. It encouraged behavior that made large-scale societies possible. Anthropologists have observed that the more complex a society becomes, the more likely it is to develop a powerful, moralizing high god. Small hunter-gatherer groups don't usually have all-powerful gods who judge human behavior. Their spirits might be mischievous or unpredictable, but they don't enforce moral codes. Moralizing gods appear mainly in agricultural and early urban civilizations, where people needed stronger mechanisms of control. The divine hierarchy expanded alongside irrigation systems, taxation, and law codes. This correlation is not accidental. A god who watches everything makes social order easier to maintain. When people think the highest authority is always observing, even in total secrecy, rule-breaking feels dangerous in a way human punishment never could. No god, judge, or king could match the reach of a divine surveillance system. The idea of an all-seeing deity worked as a psychological scaffold, holding societies together where human institutions were too fragile to succeed on their own. As religions matured, they didn't just regulate behavior, they shaped worldviews. They offered stories that answered existential questions long before people had the tools to study them. Why are we here? What happens when we die? Why do bad things happen? Religion supplied narratives that tied everything together in a way that felt complete. These stories became the lens through which people interpreted the world. Once a worldview is in place, the mind protects it. People filter information through the frameworks they already trust, which is why religious beliefs can survive even overwhelming contradictory evidence. Another key force behind divine hierarchy is the human desire for fairness. People couldn't accept a universe where injustice went unpunished. If someone caused harm and got away with it, belief in an ultimate judge restored emotional balance. A cosmic scorekeeper made the world feel morally stable. This belief grew stronger in societies where inequality was common. When life felt unfair, the idea that justice existed somewhere else in another realm, or after death, provided psychological relief. This wasn't proof, it was coping. Stories of moral judgment also reinforced obedience. If every action carried eternal consequences, people were more likely to accept rules that benefited rulers. Spiritual narratives became a kind of social currency. The threat of punishment or the promise of reward extended beyond life itself, creating a system no human authority could match in scope. This helped religions maintain control even when their temporal power fluctuated. Over time, divine hierarchy became less about explaining nature and more about defining identity. Belonging to a religious group meant sharing stories, rituals, and a sense of collective purpose. These shared beliefs created strong internal bonds and strong boundaries between groups. When people saw their religion as part of who they were, questioning it felt like losing part of themselves. This emotional attachment made belief systems resistant to change, even when evidence challenged them. Religious identity also created competition. Different groups believed their gods were superior, chosen, or uniquely true. This competition sometimes drove conflict, as each group tried to defend or expand its worldview. Conquests, migrations, and cultural exchanges reshaped divine hierarchies. Victorious groups often reinterpreted defeated gods as evil forces, fallen angels, or lesser spirits. Religious history is filled with examples of old deities being demonized to strengthen new belief systems. As civilizations expanded, religious institutions became centers of power. Temples collected wealth, managed lands, and influenced politics. Priests became educators, advisors, and interpreters of sacred laws. With control over knowledge and ritual, they shaped how people understood their place in the world. Over centuries, religious institutions built traditions, texts, and hierarchies that reinforced their authority. These systems became self-sustaining, passing beliefs from one generation to the next. Even as science began to answer questions more reliably, religions adapted. They reinterpreted old stories metaphorically. They updated moral teachings to fit changing norms. They selectively emphasized parts of their texts that aligned with new values. This flexibility kept them relevant, even when their original explanations for natural events were no longer credible. The divine hierarchy survived not because it was true, but because it was deeply woven into culture, psychology, and social structure. The next part will explore how holy texts gained their authority, how divine rules were shaped by the politics of their time, why religions resist revision, and how belief persists even when its foundations weaken. Once human societies developed writing, religion gained one of its most powerful tools: permanence. Stories that once changed from village to village were suddenly frozen on clay tablets, scrolls, and carved inscriptions. This shift elevated certain traditions above others. A belief written down became more authoritative than one shared orally, even if the oral tradition had existed longer. Writing gave the illusion of certainty. A text looked timeless even though it reflected the concerns, politics, and worldview of its specific era. Holy texts weren't created in a single moment. They were assembled gradually, shaped by editors, translators, and rulers who wanted consistency or control. Different accounts were merged, contradictions were glossed over, and passages were added or removed to fit the needs of the time. Over centuries, a patchwork of cultural memories was turned into a unified sacred narrative. People who later encountered these texts saw them as divinely inspired, unaware of the countless human decisions that shaped them. The authority of these texts depended heavily on who controlled them. Priests, scholars, and scribes often had exclusive access, which gave them tremendous influence. When few people could read, those who interpreted the texts could dictate how others understood the world. This gatekeeping made religion not just a system of beliefs, but a system of information management. Sacred knowledge became a form of power. The contents of holy texts revealed the priorities of early societies. Many rules addressed practical concerns: food safety, hygiene, property rights, inheritance, marriage, and social hierarchy. But because these rules were framed as divine commands, they gained a kind of permanence that outlasted their original purpose. Practices rooted in ancient economic or environmental conditions were preserved for centuries, simply because they were written in sacred contexts. This rigidity created tension as societies changed. When new scientific discoveries emerged, when social norms evolved, or when moral understanding expanded, religious authorities often resisted reform. Changing a sacred text meant admitting it contained human limitations. Instead, interpretations were stretched, metaphors were emphasized, and inconvenient passages were minimized. Religion adapted, but slowly, and always with the appearance of continuity. Some belief systems preserved contradictory teachings because removing them risked undermining the idea that the text was perfect. Instead of editing outdated passages, religious leaders reinterpreted them in increasingly complex ways. Entire traditions of commentary emerged, each layer distancing the religion from its original cultural context. Many modern believers interact more with these interpretations than with the raw texts themselves. Another factor that solidified the divine hierarchy was ritual. Rituals don't just express belief, they reinforce it. The more someone repeats a practice, prayer, sacrifice, fasting, recitation, the more natural it feels. Rituals become habits, habits become identity, and identity becomes belief. People often confuse the emotional comfort produced by ritual with evidence for its truth. This emotional reinforcement makes belief exceptionally resilient. Rituals also create shared experiences. When groups perform the same actions, chant the same lines, or celebrate the same festivals, they strengthen social cohesion. They feel connected to something larger than themselves. This sense of unity is powerful enough to maintain belief even when the explanations behind the rituals become outdated. The practice survives because the emotional bond it fosters remains strong. Ritual also serves a political purpose. Authorities use it to maintain order and mark boundaries between the faithful and outsiders. People who participate in ritual signal loyalty, which strengthens group identity. Leaders can see who is committed and who is not. This is why rituals often become more elaborate. As religions grow, complexity creates commitment, and commitment creates control. When people invest time, effort, and emotion into a belief system, they're less likely to abandon it. One of the most overlooked aspects of divine hierarchy is how religions use story structure. Humans are wired to understand the world through narratives with characters, motives, conflict, and resolution. Abstract truths feel distant, but stories feel alive. When gods are framed as characters, their actions make sense within a narrative arc. People relate to them, fear them, admire them, and model their behavior after them. This storytelling approach makes belief more intuitive and memorable. Religious stories often follow patterns found in folklore and myth across many cultures: miraculous births, heroic trials, floods, battles between good and evil, journeys into the underworld, and divine interventions. These patterns reflect universal human experiences. They resonate emotionally, which makes them spread more effectively. Familiar stories stitched into cosmic narratives give religions a literary advantage. Ideas packaged as stories are easier to transmit, harder to forget, and more resistant to criticism. Another element that strengthened divine hierarchies was exclusivity. Many religions claimed not just to be true, but to be the only truth. This claim wasn't driven by evidence, it was driven by survival strategy. If a religion convinced its followers that all other paths were false or dangerous, it reduced the risk of losing members to competing beliefs. Over time, this exclusivity gave religious institutions more control. They could set strict rules, demand obedience, and punish dissent because leaving the faith meant losing access to salvation, community, or identity. Fear played a major role as well. The fear of divine punishment, social exclusion, or eternal suffering kept many people within religious boundaries. Even when they doubted, fear made them hesitate to leave. The threat didn't need to be real. It only needed to feel possible. When a belief system gets tied to consequences that cannot be disproven, it becomes extremely difficult to challenge. Someone could spend their entire life following rules based on threats that exist only in stories, yet those stories shape their decisions more strongly than anything visible. One of the most interesting dynamics in religious evolution is the way gods change as human knowledge improves. When people didn't understand storms, gods controlled the weather. When people learned more, divine responsibilities shifted into other areas. When medicine explained disease, gods became guardians of spiritual or moral health instead. When astronomy explained the stars, gods retreated from the sky and moved into the realm of the soul. The domain of divine authority shrank each time human understanding expanded, but religion adapted by redefining what the divine meant. This process shows how belief systems protect themselves. When a natural explanation appears, religious interpretation simply migrates to a domain science hasn't yet addressed. This creates a moving boundary where the divine always stays just beyond human understanding. But this boundary keeps shrinking. Issues once attributed to gods' fertility, crop failure, mental illness, natural disasters now have concrete explanations. Religion remains influential, not because it provides better answers, but because it provides meaning for people who aren't satisfied with the randomness of life. Meaning, identity, and fear are powerful forces. They don't respond to evidence the same way scientific questions do. A person who finds comfort in divine hierarchy isn't convinced by data alone. Their belief isn't just intellectual, it's emotional, social, and psychological. Challenging a belief system means challenging a worldview, a community, and often a personal history. That's why religious ideas persist even when their foundations are thin. The next part will explore how religions maintain power over individuals, how belief systems evolve in the modern world, how social pressure reinforces divine hierarchy, and how the concept of God continues to change in response to human needs. Social pressure is one of the strongest forces keeping religious systems alive. People rarely believe in isolation. They believe within families, communities, and traditions. When a belief becomes woven into the fabric of daily life, birth ceremonies, marriages, greetings, holidays, funerals, it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like the default structure of existence. Breaking away isn't just an intellectual decision. It comes with emotional, social, and sometimes economic consequences. Children grow up surrounded by symbols, rituals, and narratives long before they're capable of critical thinking. These early impressions form mental associations that are incredibly difficult to change later. When a child hears that a divine being watches over them, protects them, or judges them, the idea becomes part of how they interpret the world. The belief becomes linked to comfort, authority, or family identity. These attachments create an emotional anchor that can last a lifetime. When people question religious beliefs as adults, they often face a conflict between personal doubt and social belonging. The cost of abandoning tradition can be high. They might lose community ties, family acceptance, or even safety in extreme cases. This pressure doesn't prove the truth of a belief. It only shows how deeply interwoven it is with social structures. A belief can survive not because it's convincing, but because questioning it feels dangerous. Religions also reinforce themselves through repetition. Hearing the same ideas every week, month, or year makes them feel true through sheer familiarity. When a claim becomes part of the background noise of life, it stops being evaluated and becomes accepted. This phenomenon is not unique to religion. It applies to advertising, cultural norms, and political messaging as well. But in religion, repetition is tied to ritual, authority, and emotional weight, making it especially persuasive. Communities often reward conformity. A person who follows the rules is praised, trusted, and included. A person who doubts may be labeled rebellious, misguided, or morally questionable. These labels don't reflect evidence. They reflect group dynamics. Humans evolved to depend on social groups for survival. Losing acceptance feels threatening at a deep psychological level. This instinct keeps people aligned with the beliefs of their group, even when those beliefs conflict with reason. Religions also create strong boundaries between insiders and outsiders. These boundaries can be cultural, moral, or spiritual. Some groups teach that outsiders are misguided, dangerous, or spiritually flawed. This framing protects belief systems by discouraging contact with conflicting ideas. When people internalize these boundaries, they become suspicious of alternative viewpoints. This suspicion makes critical thinking more difficult because information from outside the group is filtered through fear. Another mechanism that preserves divine hierarchy is selective interpretation. Believers often focus on passages or teachings that align with their values while ignoring or rationalizing those that conflict with modern ethics. This selective approach allows religions to maintain relevance even when their foundational texts contain outdated or problematic ideas. Over time, reinterpretation creates a version of the religion that feels compatible with contemporary norms, even if it differs significantly from its historical origins. The flexibility of interpretation is a survival strategy. If a belief system remains static, it would eventually clash with new knowledge or cultural shifts. Adaptation allows religions to stay embedded in society while preserving the appearance of ancient authority. The core narratives remain intact, but their meaning shifts subtly across generations. This creates the illusion of timeless truth, even though the belief system has undergone centuries of evolution. Modern religions also benefit from cognitive biases. One example is confirmation bias, the tendency to notice information that supports one's beliefs and ignore information that contradicts them. People who believe in divine intervention often attribute fortunate events to supernatural involvement while dismissing misfortune as a test or mystery. This asymmetry shields belief from falsification. No matter what happens, the explanation always loops back to the same conclusion. Another bias is the tendency to remember emotional experiences more vividly. Moments of relief, hope, or gratitude during prayer create powerful memories. These moments feel meaningful, even if they could have occurred without any supernatural cause. When people recall these experiences, they often interpret them as evidence, even though emotion itself doesn't reveal the origin of the experience. People also experience cognitive dissonance when they invest heavily in a belief system. The more time, effort, and identity someone puts into a religion, the harder it becomes to accept the possibility of being mistaken. Admitting doubt feels like admitting wasted years, lost relationships, or misguided choices. To avoid that discomfort, people reinterpret signs of inconsistency as deeper truth. This psychological self-protection keeps beliefs stable even when evidence challenges them. Religious certainty often flourishes in areas where scientific literacy is limited or where institutions discourage questioning. But even in well-educated societies, belief persists because it offers emotional and existential comfort. Science can explain how things work, but it doesn't always offer meaning or purpose. Religion steps into that gap, providing narratives that make people feel significant within a larger story. This emotional appeal often outweighs rational scrutiny. The divine hierarchy continues evolving in the modern world. Some religions emphasize personal spirituality over strict doctrine. Others become more symbolic, treating scriptures as cultural wisdom rather than literal truth. New spiritual movements blend elements from different traditions, creating hybrid belief systems. These changes show that religion is not fixed. It adapts to the values and anxieties of each era. Global communication has created both challenges and opportunities for belief systems. On one hand, exposure to diverse cultures and ideas can weaken rigid doctrines. On the other hand, some groups double down on their beliefs in response to perceived threats. This polarization reflects a broader societal tension between tradition and modernity. The divine hierarchy shifts as people negotiate these pressures. Technology has also influenced how religion operates. Online communities create new forms of spiritual identity. Algorithms expose people to content that reinforces their existing beliefs, whether religious or secular. This digital environment shapes belief through repetition. Emotional narratives and community support, the same mechanisms that maintained ancient religions, now accelerated by modern platforms. Even as traditional religions face declining membership in some regions, belief in supernatural forces remains common. People may reject organized religion while embracing ideas about energy, destiny, or unseen guidance. These beliefs operate much like older gods. They personalize the universe, offer comfort against uncertainty, and create a sense of connection. The language changes, but the psychological mechanisms remain the same. The concept of God continues to evolve because it reflects human needs more than cosmic facts. As long as people face uncertainty, fear, loneliness, or existential questions, some form of divine hierarchy will likely persist. But understanding how these beliefs originated, how they were shaped by human imagination, social structures, and cognitive tendencies offers a clearer view of why they feel powerful even when they lack evidence. The next part will explore how religions respond to modern challenges, why some beliefs collapse while others reinvent themselves, and how understanding the human origins of gods can reshape how we think about meaning, morality, and the future of spirituality.